First of all, to start with, my mom and dad's history goes back, each of them, over 100 years. So because we're basically focusing on Royal Oak area and Saanich, I'm going to focus mainly on my dad and my dad's family. But I also give you some interesting things about my mom's family as well, and my mom. So I'll start by saying my dad is Ralph Leslie Punt. He was born in Edmonton, Alberta on September 28, 1922. And he died on May the 1st, 2006. And he was in Broadmead Lodge, and he got excellent treatment there. He was just a wonderful place to be. My mom is Sylvia June Burkett. She was born in Victoria, BC on June the 2nd, 1924, and died on December the 19th, 2016. And she was first in the Oak Bay Lodge, and then she was in the Broadmead Lodge. And she was quite a rebel. When she was in Oak Bay Lodge, she had dementia, was a type of dementia that was not from like Alzheimer's. It was from a lack of oxygen to her brain. And she was very funny with her dementia, very alert with it. And but she couldn't tolerate any roommates. She wouldn't share anything with anybody. And we had some very funny episodes. When I went in to see her at Oak Bay Lodge one day, she was in a massive fight with her roommate, and the roommate was yelling, "I can't stand her. I can't stand living with her. I need to move." And my mother's yelling back, "Shut up. You're not my boss, and you're not my mom, and I'm nobody's Joe." She's telling me this. And at the same time, Mom would be using all her face cloths, so the woman was getting quite mad about that. So they labeled all Mom's face cloths, and Mom said to me, "Look at how stupid the other woman is. They've labeled it face cloths because she doesn't know which ones to use," but it was actually because of her, right? So anytime they brought a new guest into the lodge, they always you say, "Could you come and take your mother aside?" Because she was very territorial with her area. But, which I don't blame them. They get put into a home and a small room, and they've lost everything all their personal belongings, and they go into a small little quarters with very little of anything that they have left. So they hang on to what they've got. So you can sort of see some of that. And anyways, now I'll go on to my dad's mom. My dad's mom was Lottie May Reed. She was born on June the 8th, 1892, and she died on March the 27th, 1932, and she was only 39 at that time. My dad was 9 at that time. She lived on Seven Oaks in Saanich, where I also lived during the first few years of my marriage before I moved to Kamloops. Her dad was Cornelius Reed, and her mother was Elizabeth Gary. And I'll talk more about them later on, of where they lived. Dad's dad was Harry Wesley Punt. He was born on April 24th, 1891. He died on March the 26th, 1946. At that time, he lived in Port Kells, Surrey. His wife then was Annie. Harry's dad was George Punt, and his mother was Margaret Baker. There were 5 kids in Dad's family: Morris, Russell, Ruth, the only girl, Alvin, and Dad, and I'll talk about them later. Mom's mom was Clara Anais Hance, and she was from England, and she was born on July the 21st, 1889. And we don't know the names of her parents, and she died, I think, on September the 15th, 1955. Mom's dad was Archibald Richard Burkett from England. He was born on February 17th, 1884, and he died, I think, on October 5th, 1959. His mother's name was Elvina Ramsden. His father's name was John William Burkett, and he was my grandma's 3rd husband. She lost the first 2 in World War I, so she was quite the gal, I think. Dad and the family moved to Victoria from Edmonton when Dad was 7 months old. Dad's grandparents, the Reeds, lived at the corner of Keating Cross Road and Central Saanich Road. Their actual address was 6682 Central Saanich Road. The home is still there, and part of their parkland, or part of their home, the farmland, was changed into a bit of a park, and it's right at the corner there. It's a very open lot. That was where they farmed and had a lot of things there. And they were very friendly with the Mrs. Butcher from Butcher's Gardens, and they used to horse and buggy back and forth between their home and Butcher Gardens. And I've got a picture of them actually over there in the tea gardens of Butchert's Gardens before it was Butchert Gardens. So it was Mrs. Butchert. And the municipality bought that property off them to make that park, which there's really nothing on it, for $2,500. And I can remember my dad telling me he spent a lot of time there, and my grandfather died there, and he remembered hanging onto the bedpost. I guess he died hanging onto the bedpost, so I'm not really sure what happened. And another home that Lottie resided in is also still standing, and it's by the Co-op gas station on the highway there by Tanner Road, and it's there's a newer pink house in there, but their home that she lived in when she was younger is in the bushes kind of there, and it's still, I think, being rented out by somebody there. It's right near the gas station, but you can't really see it from the highway. It's in behind the trees. And I'm not sure where Lottie, Harry, and the kids lived during the earliest years, but when Dad was 9 years old, Lottie and the kids lived in a home on stumps on Claremont Avenue. And it was, my Aunt Ruth said it was Sawdust Valley it was called, so I don't really know where that came from. And my dad remembers his mom working long hours, mending clothes and placing newspapers in their socks and pants to keep them warm in the winter. For all my growing up years, whenever I asked my dad what he wanted for Christmas, he would always ask for a pair of socks. That was always the thing he had, was always cold. And he remembers his mom loving to dance, and she would go to dances with Mr. Mycock. So I don't know, I never knew the senior Mycock father, but he used to take her dancing all the time, apparently. And Harry Punt, my dad's dad, had left Lottie and the 5 kids a long time ago. In fact, he left when Lottie became pregnant with my dad, who was the youngest. I never knew him at all. When Dad was 9 years old, his mom became very ill with peritonitis and was unable at that time to get prompt treatment, and she died very young. The 5 kids then hitchhiked to their Aunt Mildred's place, which was Lottie's sister, and I think she was living in Alder Street at the time. And she was on her honeymoon with my Uncle Patty, and she had to come home off the honeymoon to 5 children, and it's not really what she envisioned, I think, as a new bride. But at that time, the government wanted to step in and seize all the children, and because my dad was the youngest at 9, and put them in different homes. And the minister of my aunt's church pleaded with the government not to separate the children. So the government wrote, I've still got these letters, the government wrote a letter back to my Aunt Mildred saying, okay, you can keep the kids together and keep them with you, but we're not going to pay you any money. So she ended up having these 5 kids and ended up having 2 of her own afterwards. So there were 7 kids altogether there. And the kids she had there were Martin and Patricia. Martin and Patricia are still around, and I am in contact with them quite a bit. And by the time my dad was 13, he had to quit school and go to work. He worked in a bakery and would walk the streets with my Aunt Mildred, collecting bottles for money. Aunt Mildred, it used to work in an insane asylum, and someone tried to strangle her there, I found out from my Auntie Ruth. And then she worked for Rogers Chocolates for years, cooking chocolate on her wood cook stove, and by that time she'd moved to 600 Speed Avenue, which is now an industrial area opposite Mayfair Mall. And my Aunt Mildred had another sister besides Lottie. Her name was Florence, who married my Uncle Charlie, and their last name was Lily. They had 3 kids. Vincent, he was a sergeant major, and he was stationed in Vernon and trained a lot of soldiers at that time. I'm not sure what his exact role was. I remember him, though. Lavina and Ron. Uncle Charlie had a wooden leg, which we knew nothing about it as kids. And he used to come and tell us he can pass a pencil through his legs all the time, and he'd stick this pencil. We'd always wonder, how did he do that? And then we learned years later he had this wooden leg and he'd slide it through, right? So Uncle Morris taught my dad and the other siblings to swim when they were living on Claremont by just throwing him into Elk Lake. Dad and the rest of the kids retaliated by tormenting my Uncle Morris. They would stone his car and then run under it to hide. The boys also used to jump on the streetcars in town and they'd disconnect all the cables. They were kind of free-wheeling kind of kids. When Dad was 16, World War II was imminent. He and my Uncle Al, his brother, they enlisted in the army to go to war. Dad lied about his age and was sent overseas, fighting on the front lines at the age of 18. He witnessed unthinkable horrors then, which he never talked about until he was interviewed in his 80s by Blake Heathcote, which the books are over here. He wrote 2 books about Canadian soldiers, The Testaments of Honor and A Soldier's View, and they're over here. And they also videoed my father for that. And that was the first and only time I ever saw my dad cry, reliving the war. It was horrendous what he witnessed at his young age. And he returned from overseas in 1945 aboard the HMCS Crescent and married my mom, Sylvia June Burkett, about a month later in January 1946. And actually, I was born 9 months later, so they were busy right off the bat. Alvin never went overseas due to being blind in one eye, and he was on the rifle range at Heels with my dad when they were training to go overseas. And he had been injured years ago. He'd lost the sight in one eye, and the sergeants would make them put the rifle on one side and then on the other side, and he never moved the rifle to the other side. He always kept it on the one side. And the sergeant caught that and made him move the rifle over, and he wasn't able to see, of course, and he was immediately discharged. It caused a very serious upset for my Uncle Al, and he started drinking, and he drank a lot, and I never remember ever seeing my Uncle Al sober in my whole life. I loved him to death. He loved us kids. It was just a sad thing that what happened. He never really got over being discharged, being, not allowed to go overseas with my dad. And he died at 51 or 52. And at that time, he had 5 or 6 kids. I'm not sure. They weren't very old at the time. And from what I can remember, they were all redheads. And they're scattered all over. We're not really quite sure where they are. And my Uncle Russ and Morris, they're the brothers, my dad's brothers, they went into construction. And one of Uncle Morris's projects was helping build Bleethman's gas station, which Carol knows about. And it's now the Petrocan at the corner of West Saanich Road and Viewmont Avenue. He also helped construct the building behind the gas station, and I don't know if people remember, or that building is still there. It had kind of a curved window setting. And at the time he built that, he was asked by the owner to build that curve because the fellow's wife was in a wheelchair, and he wanted her to be able to view the valley in her wheelchair and wheel back and forth in those windows. So, and then my Uncle Russ, he worked for Wheaton Construction, and he was a slave driver, I think. I kind of laugh about him. He'd have funny stories about his employees. He thought nothing of firing somebody if they didn't work hard. He played hard, he worked hard, and he expected his employees to work hard also. So he was a really tough guy to work for, but he was involved in many major big building constructions here. My dad worked for the BC Electric and the BC Hydro for 35 years, and he was a cable splicer. And actually, when he retired, he had fallen off the back of one of his work trucks, and he broke his hip, and that kind of led to his early retirement because it never healed really that well, and he was always in pain constantly with that. And my Auntie Ruth, my dad's sister, she lived until about 2 years ago. She was in her late 90s, and she married a fellow named Bill Fletcher, and they lived in Vancouver for all the time I knew in a big old home. I don't remember too much. She passed away about a year or 2 ago. I'm not sure how long. I have a photo album there of her son, as one of her grandsons or sons has put all her pictures together, which is great. And she had 5 kids: Bill, Arlie, John, Tom, and Tony. Tony she had later, and Tony is sang at her 80th birthday, and he sings My Way just exactly like Frank Sinatra. He's a very talented fellow. And Arlie, her only daughter she passed away quite young of breast cancer. My Uncle Morris married Babe, and they had 3 kids, which most of you probably know here: Bud, Shirley, and Beverly. Bud worked for Disney World in Florida for years and years, I believe, and he's still in down that area, I think. And Shirley is still here, and Beverly is up island. And my Uncle Russ, he had 3 kids: Philip, Rusty, and Wendy. Russell's wife was Phyllis, was somehow connected to the Turner Ranch, I'm not sure, and the Mitchell Farms. We are not sure. They used to horse and buggy back and forth there. I'm not sure where the connection was. One of my cousins was telling me about that. And my uncle, my Auntie Phil's father was John Adams, and he was an iron worker, and their home was on the gorge. It's still there. And he poured the mold for all the hanging flower baskets in the city. That's one of the things. And their home that they had on the gorge is in the Saanich Heritage magazine that Marg has told us about, and we have, right? And Dad and Mom, they had us 3 kids, Diana, Jerry, and Bob. We grew up at 4290 Dieppe Road, and it was a VLA home, as all the homes were. There was Dieppe and Caen and Normandy. All these streets were named after places in the war. And Fast Poultry Farm was at one end near Douglas Street, and we didn't have the Pat Bay Highway then. It was just, we all were on about an acre of property at least. Some of the kids living around us on Caen, Dieppe, Douglas, and Quadra were Rhonda and Laurie Williams. I'll have to read these out because I won't remember them all. Stacy Waite, Marguerite and Barbara Post and their grandparents, Bob, Calvin and Marissa Lee, Todd, Joanne and Shannon Stewartson, Gary and Robert Wicks, Gary and Lynn Edwards and Doug Reginald was living with their family for a while, the Hoffs, the Fairburns, Brian, Marianne, Michael and Heather, Doug Baker, Robbie Hawes, Ken and Cheryl Mason, Brenda Hepworth, Dennis and Karen Levy, Kathleen and Josephine Tyler, Tommy Robertson, Ian Broadfoot, Dave and Jack Wallace, Gary and Leslie McDonald, Jan Fletcher, Betsy Fulton, who also married one of the Wicks boys, Diane Bolton and her sister, Norman Wright, and Peter and Valerie Blair. This is just to name a few of the kids that I remember in our area. We played outdoors all day long until our mums whistled or called us to come home for dinner. Rithitz Bog was a regular play area. My friend Sue used to jump on a horse there called Star. I never knew who it belonged to, but it was always in the Rithitz Bog, sitting, standing there doing really nothing, and she'd climb on it, and we never knew who owned it. Many years were spent at the ballparks where my brothers played ball. Les Ritz Park they played at, and on Reynolds Road, I think it was. Mom used to heckle the umpires severely in those days. They were mainly Doug and Pernell Hudlin. Probably a lot of athletes know who they were. And she often came home with her hands totally bruised. She'd be clapping, 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 and her hands would be black and blue. And she was so into the ball games that one time when my youngest brother was running from third base to home, she actually ran out of the stands onto the diamond and ran down the third baseline and slid into home plate with my brother. So she was quite the rebel. In the late 1950s or 60s, the construction of the new Pat Bay Highway began, and all the homes on Douglas Street, which would be the Fultons, Fletchers, Olsons, Boltons, they were removed, and part of our properties on Dieppe were taken away for the building of that highway. And I did have some pictures of the Saanich trucks building that highway, but I'm not sure what I've done with them. They might be on an old video that I have of my mom's, I'm not sure, a movie where I saw them, but I had the trucks driving along. But we were kind of bratty as kids. We used to run down Quadra Street, because Dieppe came on to Quadra then, and we'd go down where the trucks were slowly driving along, and we'd wait till they were very close, and then we'd dash quickly across in front of their trucks, and they'd have to slam the brakes on. And they really quite hated us kids around there. But anyways, and on Van Elman, there was a farm and a golf driving range, and Floyd Adams raised miniature horses on that farm. And we picked golf balls there for 50 cents a bucket, and I think the buckets held 50 balls, so we got a penny a ball. The Greyhound bus made 2 runs to Sydney, one in the morning and one at night, stopping at Dieppe and Douglas Street. And the city bus stop was on Beckwith Avenue, just below Burgess Dairy Farm. And I can remember my brother and his friends were always trying to outsmart the Olsen boys that lived on the back of, on Douglas Street they actually lived. And they would hammer and build forts for hours on end. And then the Olsen boys would come whipping up to our place, and they'd smash the fort down. And they were kind of bigger and stronger boys. And so my brother and his friends would gather together, and they'd wait till Ricky and his friends built a fort there, and they'd sneak down there hoping they weren't going to be caught, and they'd break down their forts. And this went on for years. I don't know how many years they did this and how many months, but it was quite funny. And the Stewartsons down the street, they used to have a horse there named Chinook, and that Frank McGee was quite into horses at that time, and he used to come and break these horses in. And he used to also cut all the back of our properties for hay. You know, he'd bring a tractor in, and we had so much overgrown grass there. And when we went to town, my mom used to rent baby carriages from Robinson Sporting Goods, and Robinson Sporting Goods is still there, and they were 25 cents to rent. And she always, sometimes, shouldn't say always, sometimes didn't have the best of reasoning. And one time she was pushing my youngest brother, Bob, in the baby carriage, and they had those baby carriages with the flap on the back. And she was oblivious to, I guess, what was going on in the carriage, and he fell out the end of it, and he was on the pavement. And he was only about 5 months old, but I can remember that happening. And then another time, we had on Dieppe, we had a clothesline that the line was lower at the back door, and it went uphill to a pole, and she thought she'd put our dog Toby on a run there. He had a long lead, and she tied the leash to the clothesline pole, and of course he went running away, and he went whoop, and he was up in the air, and he was flapping around in the breeze like a sheet hanging from the clothesline, and we had to reel him in, but... and then we spent many hours at Beaver Lake, and I'm sure a lot of you will remember we danced to the music. Sadler's had a jukebox there, and everybody used to go down there and rock and roll at the jukebox. And then the Black Swan and Tasty Spot at Happy Land, we called them there, were popular hangouts. Few of us had cars. We walked everywhere. And we also picked berries, strawberries it mainly was. The Kellos had a strawberry farm at the bottom part of the Claremont Hill, where Claremont meets or I think it's Halliburton, pardon me, not Claremont. At the lights there was a big strawberry farm there, and we used to pick berries there. And we'd walk and pick berries and then go home. And then one time, my mom and dad, they had a Volkswagen Beetle, and 5 of us, the 3 of us kids and my mom and dad, both of them smoking, had this Volkswagen Beetle, and we went all the way to California. And in those days, the trunk was in the front, so you hardly had any room. And they had that little seat in the back. It was kind of carpeted in there, and it was kind of the big thing. And we'd fight like cats and dogs, the kids and I, my brothers and I, to get in that back spot and scrunch in there. And while they were driving in a complete haze of smoke, you know. But anyways, and then we also spent a lot of time going to Raft River Beach in Parksville area, and in those days it wasn't government run like it is now, and we camped right on the beach. Like, it was beautiful, you know, it was really nice. And we roller skated, and I'm sure some of you remember this, that on Douglas Street there was a roller dome there, and it later became Thunderbird Electrical Supplies. I'm not sure what the roller dome was before that, but everybody used to roller skate there. And in one of those pictures, I've got some of the roller skates that we used to have. And the area, I think, is where the Canadian Tire on Douglas Street recently closed in the last few years. I think that's where it was. And we also ice skated on Quicks Pond and Panama Flats, and everybody remembers that, I'm sure. And we had a wood cook stove and picked up ice for our fridge on Harold Street. I remember the guy coming out with these great big picks and picking up this big block of ice, and we'd take it home. And we had milk delivery then with foil caps and cream on the top, and we folded foil caps on our bike spokes for trying to make them fancy. And in grade 1, our class made butter by taking turns shaking a jar full of cream that they had brought, the teacher brought to school, until it solidified. And at that time, our teacher, we had our grade 1 and 2, was Miss Southwell. We were also taught to knit, and we all made a square for an Afghan, and I think that Afghan was sent to Africa. We all knitted a little square for the Afghan. And at that time, we had a wonderful elementary school principal, Mr. Wilway, who had a prosthetic arm, and we loved him. He was just a great guy. And our roller skates and ice skates were the strap-on kind. We never had any of these fancy boot types. And we had party line phones. And I was 8 years old when we got our first TV, and I can remember my dad being ecstatic when he saw the Indian head test pattern come on the screen. And he's yelling, "It's working!" And all we were looking at, we were trying to line everything up to the Indian head test pattern. But my dad, it was not like kids today where they take the control and flick the TV. My dad had absolute control over that TV and what went on. We watched what he wanted, right? So anyways, and then when I was 9 years old, we used to go every Sunday to the Hydro. Had a bus depot or a ice cream place. We used to go and get ice cream, and Dad would take us on Sunday for a Sunday paper. And we came back from that trip one time, and I can remember being at 9 years old, smelling smoke and a burning smell in my home. And we didn't have smoke alarms in those days, and my dad said, "Oh, it's just your mom's cooking." She had a wood cook stove, and he was laughing about it. But I persisted, and I said, I keep smelling like wood's burning. It took a while, and finally he got up to decide to have a look, and half our house was on fire. And this is before, I think they didn't have the Pat Bay Highway then, and the traffic was all lined up along the highway and down Quadra Street, watching the smoke billowing out our windows, and we had no idea that our home we were inside it and it was burning. And we lost half our home at that point, all our pictures, and I can remember my dad yelling that the house was on fire, and he closed all the windows and tried to contain everything. And then one of the neighbors came and opened the front door, and the fire just went, that noise, I can always remember it to this day. It just burned half our place down. And what didn't burn, we had smoke damage, severe. It was black, looked like tar all over the walls, everywhere. So it took a long time for my, Mom I remember her crying a lot over that, losing all her family photos and wedding pictures and everything. So now in our teens, I'm going back now, we used to have poodle skirts and ducktails and Brill cream and a little dabble-do-ya, this stuff. And drapes, I don't know if any of you remember what drapes were. They were the guys' pants with the narrow white belts, and my mother used to say, "Look at those hoods over there with those pants on," and I used to think they looked so cool. And Elvis was the king of rock and roll. On Douglas Street, near the Hudson's Bay store, most of us girls, we went to Miss Frith Millinery, the Sally Shop, and Gibson Girl. And Gibson Girl, I think, is where I got my wedding dress, actually. And Eaton's and Woolworth were at the other end of Douglas. Although my mom did not grow up in Saanich, she was born and raised here. She lived to a feisty 92 years of age. She went to North Ward School with Helen from McMorran's and Janet Cairns, not her maiden name. And I can tell you a funny story, and you might want to edit this, Daryl, I'm not sure. But her and Daryl Cairns' mom, Janet, fought nonstop on the way to school, on the way home every day. And my mother would call her pimple-faced and pigeon-toed, and Janet would call my mom Bucket of because her last name was Burkett. And they ended up when they grew up, were the best of friends. They had a lot to do with in their married lives. So the saying, "Sticks and stones hurt your bones, names will never hurt you," and that's very true in that case. And she also went to school, a Northward School, with Helen from McMorran's. I don't know what Helen's last name was, but they went to school there. I think I just said that, I'm not sure. Her home was 915 Hillside Avenue, and this is now where they're building the Oak Bay Lodge, and they're building it right on the actual site where her home actually used to be. And so I went there one day to ask the foreman if I could put some of my mom's ashes there, because that's what she wanted. And it was quite a strange request. They said in all their years on a job site, no one's ever asked to have any ashes put in their job site, so it was quite funny. But on the corner of Quadra and Hillside, we used to go where Mom lived too. There was Stelk's Hardware. I don't know if anybody remembers Stelk's Hardware. And there was also the roundabout at Hillside and Douglas, where you could witness or be a part of multiple road rage occurrences during rush hour. And I can remember being in my mom and dad's car sometimes, and I'd look out the window and I could see people's mouths going. You couldn't hear anything, but they were so mad, yelling. It was always quite funny. My Auntie Peggy, that married my mom's brother, Uncle Bob, she was Margaret, her real name was Margaret Gillies, and she worked at the Saanich Municipal Hall for years, and pictures of her are in the Saanich archives, and I have pictures of her over on the display there. And they had a little home, and it's still around, on Waterloo Avenue, which sold. It was on a large, large lot, but when she died, it ended up being sold. And lucky 13 was a very lucky number for my family, and my kids were born on the 13th, so that's exciting, my boys. But my grandfather, in the First World War, he sat down on the battlefield and he had his pay book in his pocket, and he had a badge number 13, and he had a stopwatch in the pocket, and he got shot. And the bullet destroyed the badge. It put a hole in the pay book and stopped the stopwatch on the 13th hour. And they've always said forever, because the badge was number 13, that 13 was our lucky number. So I was always happy when my kids were born on the 13th, because that's a lucky thing for me. And so closing, I'd just like to say my childhood was very different from what it is today. We are baby boomers without instant gratification from electronic devices. We figure things out without technology. How did we ever survive? I'm not sure. We were ostracized by our peers if we behave ourselves properly, and now everybody can text. If they fight and they text over a phone, I don't understand it. I wouldn't trade that era for growing up with any other era. We never had much money, and going without was common. I often wonder what the next generation will be like. I'd like to be a fly on the wall. I'd like to have been a fly on the wall during the old days, and would certainly love to be a fly on the wall during the next wave of baby boomers. And I plan to live till I'm 100, so maybe I'll see that. So there you go. That's it.
The Mahons on Mann Avenue. My grandfather, William Mahon II, was a Nova Scotian Bluenose who sailed on the China tea clippers around the southern tips of South America, known as Cape Horn. His father was a seafarer who was lost at sea just before my grandfather was born. His mother always told him he was not going to sea, period. When he was 12 years old, he ran away on his uncle's boat as a cabin boy. He made many trips at sea, eventually locating in the Orient, where he obtained his master's papers. He was for some time a captain with NYK Shipping Company, a large Japanese firm. He later earned pilot's papers and became chief pilot for the Shanghai Harbor in China. He married Grace Dallas, a widow with 3 children, whom he adopted. They eventually had 5 more children, one of whom died in infancy in the flu epidemic. Another died at age 5 when she ran into their busy road in North Vancouver and was instantly killed. William and Grace traveled back and forth from Shanghai to Canada until he retired in 1933 and made their home on Mann Avenue. William died in 1936, and his widow remained in the family home until her death in 1977 at age 97.
And where are all the kids now in the family?
Well, my 5 sons have finally all come home. The last one came home from Kelowna just a couple of months ago. They all decided this was home.
And what about your siblings? Like, we went to school with Dennis.
Well, Dennis is in Saanich. He's having a hard time right now because his wife has MS very badly, and she doesn't know anybody. And she's having experimental treatment, which they hope will make it better. And it seems to be helping a little bit. And then Charlie, my brother, is in Prince George. He goes around when people want to buy houses, and he does I forget what you call it, but he goes over it to see what's wrong and what needs to be done. And he doesn't tell them not to buy it or to buy it. He says, well, this is what is wrong with it, and this is what you can do quite well to fix it. So if you buy it, it's up to you. But he was for many years a carpenter, so he knows what he's doing. And my sister is in Penticton, and she's been widowed for quite a few years, but her daughter, who is a nurse, lives in Penticton.
That's Marjorie you're speaking of.
And that's Marjorie, yes.
She was in the Air Force. Could you expand on your siblings' lives?
Oh, my sister she left school at 16 and joined the Air Force and spent 3 years in the Air Force. And then when she came home, she worked at the dockyard. And that's where she met her husband and they got married. And he was a widower with 2 children, and then they had 2 more of their own, all girls. And my brother Charlie had 5 girls. And we had 5 boys. And my brother Dennis had a girl and a boy and a girl.
Was he a Victoria City police officer or a Saanich police officer?
He was Victoria City. He spent over 30 years in it, and he retired from there.
I was in Marjorie's class, and it seemed to me she talked about being in a concentration camp at one point.
Well, we were just kids when we went in. I was 9 years old 2 days after we went in the camp, and we were in there for 2.5 years. And one day we got up, and the guards were all gone. And so the men went around and made sure the gates were all secured, and we waited for the Americans to come in and free us. And they came in with chocolate bars and milk and eggs, and they gave us all that. And what they did was each serviceman took a child, and we all went out to lunch one day with these Army aircraft men. And my parents were quite okay with that. But it was such a treat, to be taken out like that.
Where was the concentration camp?
In Shanghai. They found an old army camp, and the Japanese condemned it for their horses. They said, well, we won't put our horses in there, but they put us in there. So,
What were the circumstances that caused this for you to go in? Why were you, how many of you were there?
well, I don't know, but we had, prior to that, had to walk around wearing red armbands because we were considered British. If you were Canadian, you were British under the umbrella. And so they told us we had a year and then we'd go into this concentration camp. So everybody was buying tinned food and things like that too, so they could supplement some of their income. But there were doctors in there and nurses and dentists, but they could only do so much because they didn't have supplies and they didn't have drugs or anything. So I can remember one night, this lady screamed all night long, and in the morning she was dead. And it was, I can't think what it was now. It was something that she got, and
Did they provide schooling in there for the children?
well, there were school teachers in there and they did their best, but it was very hot in the summer. It was 110 in the shade, and in the winter there was snow on the ground. So we had limited hours that we could go to school, but they did their very best. And I learned algebra and geometry and French in the camp, which helped me when I came to Canada. But
So how long were you there?
2.5 years. So, and my father would always say, when we get to Canada, you can put a glass under the tap and drink the water, because in Shanghai we had to boil the water and put it in the fridge or the ice box to cool, then we could drink it. And we also,
Parents live with the children in the camp?
pardon?
Did the parents live with the children in the camp?
Yes, we had 3 rooms. They were just, that place there would be 2 rooms, and we had another one, and that was our extent of what we had to live in. And they would come along at any time of the day or night and call a roll call, and you had to tumble out of bed, and if you, like the men in their hurry, didn't have all their pajama buttons done up, they'd get their ruler and smack them on the face and do anything to try and demean them. And just, the idea was not to fight back, because then you were in real trouble. But they tried all those kinds of things. But they never hurt the children. They liked the children, so that we were safe, really.
When you went to camp, did you take any possessions with you, or just?
We took what we could. Like my mother could take her silver and things like that. But we couldn't take any furniture. We just had to walk out and leave all her furniture there. So,
And did everybody get rescued from that camp?
yes.
And did you ever get in touch with any of them afterwards?
Well, we knew quite a few of them that were in there from living in Shanghai. But it's not the sort of thing you sort of want to get together and reminisce about.
No.
But I was 9 2 days after we went in, and I feel that I grew up then. Because I always had younger siblings that I had to keep an eye out for and things like that. And you do what you have to do. You know, but it was so nice to come to Canada.
Where did you land in Canada? Did you come right to Victoria?
Well, my grandmother lived in Victoria, or she lived in Royal Oak. And we came on a U.S. Troop ship across from Shanghai to San Francisco. And then we were in San Francisco a week, and we got the train up to Seattle. And then we got at Seattle, we got the Princess boat to Victoria. And I can still remember my grandmother in the customs office, standing there all alone waiting for us in Victoria. because she never thought she'd see her son again, so she was so thankful to see him and his family.
What was your view of Victoria just landing from a child's point of view? Did you think it was like all wilderness? Because we know it differently because of the traffic and the building up of the buildings.
No, I never thought about any of that. It was just, it was home to us because,
Freedom.
yeah. And because my father talked about it so much when we get to Canada.
Was your father a soldier?
No, he worked for the British government in the Shanghai Municipal Council. He worked in vital statistics.
So just anybody that was Canadian was rounded up?
Well, it was anybody who wasn't Chinese or Japanese that was in the camp, and there were people that were Jewish or other countries like French people or that, because they were all enemies of the Japanese.
And we did the same with the Japanese and Chinese here. We put them in camps.
But they treated them very well, I understand.
But we still took them out of their homes and put them into camps. That's incorrect.
Joy, you and Tom spent many years at Oldfield Orchard.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us a bit about that life you've had there with your sons growing up?
Well, we ran the orchard for several years, and that was quite an experience. And part of that time I went back to work for lawyers. So I had a
Did you
full,
buy it from Mr. Gobelis?
pardon?
Did you buy the farm from Mr. Gobelis?
Yes,
Yeah, so you had it many years, didn't you?
yeah. And then Derek bought it from us.
When you lived on Man Avenue, did you not have an apple orchard there? I seem to recall
Yes.
an apple orchard.
Yes, there was. And further down, there was a field, and then there was a pear orchard.
And you could ride your horses down that trail that ran along the edge of your
Yeah.
property.
It's quite different in there now.
Is your grandmother's house still there?
Pardon?
No, your grandmother's house is gone?
It's gone because they subdivided it, all the people that bought it.
Have you ever been back to Shanghai?
No, I've been to China, but not to Shanghai.
Shanghai.
I've got a cousin that lives in New Zealand, and he's been to Shanghai several times. And he found the house that my dad grew up in. It's now a Chinese institution for learning or something. It was a great big house.
Yeah.
Well, at one time, Shanghai was the third largest city in the world. After London and New York, it was Shanghai. But I'm glad that my parents did come here. They had other choices. They could have gone to England, because my mother was from England, but they decided that Canada was the place to come because we were Canadians. And his mother was here, so. Well, thank you very much for listening.